Welcome to episode 3 of Sports Talk with the Statsman. Hi there, folks. I'm Paul Bruno, and I want to thank you for joining me on my YouTube channel at PB the Statsman. Every year at this time for the past 8 seasons, I gear up for the hockey podcast that I host at RotoWire. It's called Puckcast with Statsman and AJ. You'll find it on the hockey tab at www.rotowire.com. Over at that site, we have a great bit of information, as the company is the industry leader in providing player news and notes, updated depth charts, and all kinds of daily fantasy sports information in support of your enjoyment of the major sports leagues around the world. I'll be starting my podcast cycle for the 2023-24 season over at RotoWire in 2 weeks, where we begin with a weekly look at each division in the National Hockey League. So on today's hit of this particular show, I'd like to give you a sample of what we do there when we look at team previews and what they will look like as I examine the Leaf roster ahead of the 2023-24 training camp that's going to open around the league in mid-September. So the way I see the line combinations up front for the Leafs begins as follows. We have new addition Tyler Bertuzzi, who was signed to a 1-year deal, and it's a prove-it campaign for him. And he's going to land in a really nice spot, folks. He's going to be alongside Austin Matthews and Mitch Marner on that top line. And while his stats don't look very impressive for what he did last season, it was split between 2 stops. And I think with a fresh start and a positive outlook, he's going to revert to the 30-goal shooter that he has been in his previous days in Detroit. So I look for him to add the toughness that's been lacking on that top line a little bit, but he's going to fit in with the playmaking of Mitch Marner, and Austin Matthews' sniping ability is something that should be augmented by Bertuzzi's vigor in terms of digging the puck out of corners and making a nuisance of himself in front of the net. So good opportunity for that line to grow and be even better with the dynamic duo that leads this club, thriving with the addition of Bertuzzi on that top line. I look for Matthews to revert to his 50-plus goal-scoring form, and Marner should once again threaten the 100-point mark, playing a strong two-way game. This is going to be one of the top lines in hockey, folks. And I look for the second line to remain centered around John Tavares, who's in the 6th year of his 7-year contract and still playing at a point-per-game pace. I don't think that's going to drop this year, because I think Willie Nylander's on his wing again, looking to double down on what he did last season. We all know that he's in a contract squabble right now with the club, so you know he's going to want to put his best foot forward, and this duo has performed very well together. And a guy who was a late season addition to the club making his debut, Matthew Knies, is the fellow that I have my eyes on as the guy that's going to fill out that line on the left flank. And I expect him to be a contender for the Rookie of the Year honors around the entire NHL, as he fits in with 2 veterans who are in a position to make him look good and help him fill out that top 6 and make it one of the most dynamic 6-packs around the league in terms of forwards in the NHL. On the third line, this is where it starts to get interesting, folks. People have forgotten a little bit about Nick Robertson. He was a high draft pick a couple of years ago for the club, but he has struggled with injury situations that have dogged him and wiped out last season's entire campaign. So I think he comes back to camp at full strength again, and after a good summer of getting himself physically fit, and the skills are still there. He's just a youngster in his early 20s, and I think he could be another dynamic player on this club this year, and he's going to get a chance to play with a couple of veterans that I project to be on that third unit as well. In Max Domi, another new addition who's on a prove-it campaign. He's already expressed his desire to stay with the Leafs beyond 1 season, and he's even gone out on a limb and saying he's not going to be the one that causes them salary cap issues. So you got to think that he's going to be a good citizen here, put his nose to the grindstone, and try to repeat a 56-point season that he put up last year, and he looked very good in the playoffs too with Dallas. So I expect him to drive play on that third line and be an insurance policy should Matthew Knies not work out on the second line wing position. That line will be, the third unit will be rounded out by Calle Jarnkrok, who put up his first 20-goal season as an NHLer last year. A good two-way player. He won't hurt the club defensively, and I think this club has a chance to wield 9 forwards here, all of whom are capable of 20-goal seasons. So that's the upside of the offensive unit. And the fourth line is going to have a different look too this year with the addition of Ryan Reeves. He's going to be a physical component like they haven't had here in years. And he's a modest scorer with 5 goals and 10 assists last season, for instance. But he's not here to score goals. He's here to protect the rest of the roster. And just having him on the bench is going to make some of these other guys play about 3 inches taller and 20 pounds heavier. So he'll be on the right side of that fourth line. David Camp at center. He was a very useful player for this club last year, playing very well in this role. And also on the special teams unit, it's a real luxury when you can trust a fourth line center to win a higher percentage of his faceoffs and take care of that special teams unit so they don't have to sacrifice some of their big guns in that role. Rounding out the 12 pack is Sam Lafferty, a guy who came to the club at the trade deadline last year and on the season produced 27 points, including 12 goals. I think the Leafs would take that again from him in this particular role. Another guy that will be helpful in the special teams and in the checking and the physicality department for the club. In terms of minor league options, they have some depth here to choose from. One guy that is a new addition to the mix is Dylan Gambrell. So I'll start there. He played 60 games with Ottawa last year, produced a modest 10 points. So you can see him in a fourth line role should any of the other guys falter in that space. And he'll be one of the first guys they call up in any situation because he's the most experienced forward on the depth chart that isn't on the 12-man group that I highlighted off the top. Behind him, they got Pontus Holmberg and Nick Abruzzese, Bobby McMahon, and Alex Steeves, all of whom have played with the Leafs in short spurts. And Holmberg is an interesting one for me. He produced 13 points in 37 games with the club, and he had a very nice run in the minor leagues at the AHL Farm Club with 22 more points in 38 games. So he can score a little bit, and they'll be looking at him if they need a bit of a scoring uptick because of injury up front on the regular roster. Ditto for the likes of Nick Abruzzese and Bobby McMahon, who showed some physicality in his stint with the club last year, and he produced 21 goals in only 30 AHL games too. So there's an offensive ability there that could be released if he finds his way at the NHL level as well. And rounding out the prospects among the forwards, I look at Alex Steeves, who's also been another guy with a cup of coffee at the NHL, but he's produced at almost a point per game clip last year in the AHL, so there's more upside offensively in him. On the defensive unit, I see the six-pack looking a little bit familiar going forward, with one exception, and that's the addition of John Klingberg on a second pairing. But we'll start with the first pairing. Morgan Rielly, hoping to improve on the numbers that he put up in a down regular season last year, I'll say. 41 points in 65 games, a little bit less production than we're used to seeing, but he certainly showed well in the playoffs, and it's that version of Morgan Rielly that I hope we'll see once the regular season starts. And he'll be partnered, if I have any say-so, with T.J. Brodie, a former partner of his where he played his best hockey, with this defensive-minded guy on the right flank for him. Brodie's not noted for offensive in his game, folks, but he's going to be there as the anchor to this pairing and one of the defensive specialists who leads the league in block shots and is pretty good in the physicality department as well in his own end. Jake McCabe came over at the trade deadline, and I liked what I saw from him in terms of the physical game. He's got some offensive upside. He produced 25 points last season in 76 games, and he will be the guy that I think will partner with John Klingberg. Klingberg has an interesting opportunity here, I think, where he is known as a power play specialist. He may spell or challenge Morgan Rielly for that role, because even in 67 games last year, he produced 10 goals and 23 assists, had a fine playoff as well. And I think playoff history as well, I should say. And then I look at the third pairing. We got Mark Giordano and Timothy Liljegren. We got the veteran and the youngster who paired well together at times last season. It's a pretty good look if they get another season out of Giordano like he gave them last year in the regular season. I know he tired a little bit at the end, but I'll take 24 points and his physicality and career leader in block shots as well to have one more go around with the club and have it be a successful one for him. We want to see Timothy Liljegren take the next step in his development, and I see him as being the surprise contributor to offense from the back end and building on the 18 points that he got in 67 games last year. Which takes us to the bench and the minors in terms of where we look for help in this depth chart. On the blue line, Simon Benoit was recently signed to a deal. He came from Anaheim last year, and I mean, Anaheim was a terrible hockey club, so we'll throw out his plus minus. But the thing that I like about him, he's a big guy and he likes to hit, and he's pretty solid in his defensive end. So the block shots and the hits are stats where we'll see his name quite regularly this season if he gets a look with the Maple Leafs. And Connor Timmins, who performed very well in his first few games with the Leafs, looked really good to me, but then his performance tailed off a little bit. He's ranked 8th in the depth chart here. And prospects in the minors, look for William Lagesson, who was picked up last year in a minor league, late last season in a minor league deal, and performed with the Chicago Wolves in the AHL, had 32 points in 65 games. And William Villanova, a Leaf draft pick from a couple of years ago, who's honing his skills and developing his game in the minors. He produced 25 points in 54 games. I think this kid has an offensive upside and an overall game that will translate to the NHL, and he might get his first look in that regard this season. In the Nets, they have a trio of options to consider. Of course, Ilya Samsonov resigned for a contract that went to arbitration, and that got settled, so they have no worries this season about his contract hovering over his head. 27 wins, 10 losses, and 4 shutouts last season. Good stats in terms of peripherals, 233 goals against and a .919 save percentage. He's going to be counted on to play at least 50 games for the club. And then it gets a little bit interesting for me. Joseph Woll was all but penned into the lineup for this coming season. After a cup of coffee with the Leafs, he's been a prospect that's developed his game in the minors, but he's dealt with injury woes as well. He's past that, got that in the rearview mirror finally, and I like what I saw out of him in the playoffs. He was pretty smooth, a cool customer under fire. So they're counting on him to be the number 2 guy and eat up the rest of the games that are on the schedule, something like 30 starts expected in the backup role here in Toronto. But an interesting development a couple of weeks ago came about when Marty Jones was picked up by the Leafs. This guy has been a career netminder in the NHL for over 10 years and a first stringer with a couple of clubs along the way. Last year, he split duty in Seattle. They had a fine year, and so did he, with 27 wins against 13 losses. The peripherals were not as good as Ilya Samsonov, but a 3 goals against average and an .886 save percentage plays well when you consider those numbers should improve this season behind a better club overall in Toronto, I think, defensively than the Seattle club showed at times last season. So that's the way I see this team looking going forward, and it's a sample of what we do when we have these preseason podcasts for the Statsman and AJ show podcast at RotoWire, and we'll start that in a couple of weeks. So I hope you flip over to RotoWire and check those things out, and then on a weekly basis going forward next season, we're going to produce our weekly program where we highlight who's hot and who's not, who's playing where on each roster, and any injury updates that come across our wires. So it's a top-notch service that RotoWire provides, and we really rely on it for the work that we do on the show. And you've heard today a sample of what this looks like. If you like what you've heard, please subscribe to the show and like the podcast that you're seeing here on YouTube. And circle back to me on a weekly basis. Going forward, we're going to get closer to the NHL season. There's going to be news coming out of the training camps, and we got to come back to take a look at the major leagues and see what's happening on the baseball front as the season winds down. Playoff spots are still up for grabs. And of course, the NFL is just around the corner. So a lot of news about the upcoming season in the next week or so where it begins. You'll hear some references to that and more on this podcast at YouTube. So I hope you circle back. Thank you very much for listening.